I'm pretty sure it's working. I think everything is working. I think the microphone's working. I think a bunch of stuff that wasn't working before is working. I think there's a whatever it's called, a thumbnail. I hope you can see the image of the book that I'm supposed to be talking about. And I brought up my notes, or I got notes for chapter 2. Chapter 1 of me talking about this is on my channel as like Titanic history live stream, because I had no idea how to do a title. For all I know, the title for this one isn't working, but you know, we push on. Chapter 2 deals with the Northeast. Chapter 2 is the native Northeast and the rise of British North America. It talks about an explorer named Giovanni da Verrazzano, and he meets, I think it's the, noted the less popular closed. He notes the Wabanaki Confederacy, and it has a quote from him about how the people there are beautiful, they're tall, their manner is sweet and gentle, very much like the manner of the ancients. Then it quickly skips over him because he's not going to be a player through much of this. It skips over him to talk about the Puritans, and it mentions how they imagined new societies for themselves and expected native peoples to either disappear or assimilate to become God's children. Unlike in other American colonies, religious motivations attracted settlers of a different kind to the Northeast, and it specifically says that religion was a bigger motivator than economics was to them. It mentions it mentions a few times the depopulating of the area, mostly through disease, it seems. It mentions disease quite a bit. Of the 150,000 native villagers living in the Northeast in 1600, less than 10% remained a century later. 90% perished due to European diseases, settlement pressures, warfare, and enslavement. Those who survived and experienced the dispossession soon comprised a caste of unfree labor within colonial society. As in the Spanish Empire, Indians became the first racialized labor force in America. So it does talk about the indigenous people being enslaved, and it talks about how this is really a much more forgotten piece of history. According to this, nearly 1 million Native Americans were enslaved across the Americas during the 16th and 17th centuries. So about 1 million of them enslaved in the course of 100 years. And then, here's the quote. It's on page 53. Religion, more than politics or economics, compelled 17th century reformers to fight English authority or to migrate away. And that's not really important. It talks about the company's charter was granted the Great Seal of Massachusetts. Okay, so it talks about the creation of the Great Seal of the Massachusetts Bay Company and how its seal is a reference to Acts 16:9. It doesn't really go into it. It tells you, but it's very surface level to just talk about whatever the seal. It doesn't matter. Disease. Next is it talks about Tisquantum, or more commonly known as Squanto, And it goes over his story. He's really interesting. I won't go over it a lot here, but he was enslaved and then brought over to Europe, and then like he went back to North America. I think it said he crossed the Atlantic 4 or 5 times in total. But yeah, there's quite a few pages on like just him and his enslavement, and as an example of indigenous people being enslaved. It talks about how he set up the first Thanksgiving. He brokered the earliest agreement between Plymouth and the neighboring Wampanoag Confederacy, led by Pokanoket leader Massasoit, an agreement we know as Thanksgiving. The Wampanoag later became allies of the Puritans, and then it talks about, hold on. It talks about how the Puritans came into conflict with the Dutch and with, I believe, the Pequot. The Pequot War. It talks about the Pequot War, where the indigenous or the Puritans came into conflict with other indigenous people, and how that became the Pequot War. This came about mostly because there were disputes over over wampum trade. Wampum were like these shells that you would put through like some sort of fiber, and they would be used to make like belts and necklaces and stuff like that. They became used as currency, and that was actually one of the better parts of the book, or one of the parts I liked, was because as I was reading the book, I began to feel like this wampum stuff, it sounds like it's being used as a type of currency, because before, the Dutch would trade metal and guns and tools with the indigenous people, but they started using wampum instead, and because it was easier to transport. And that's when I started to think, like, that's pretty much what money is. Money is just value that's easier to transport, and it's easier to stand in as like a good, or it's easier to put that there instead of like a good or a service. So, as I was reading, I was like, "Oh, this is like a currency." And then later, the book like confirms, yeah, it is. It was being treated like a currency. The Dutch and their allies were big purveyors or big sellers of wampum. What are they called? The Puritans later came into conflict with the Pequot mostly because of the wampum, but ostensibly because there were a couple of English traders that got killed, and John Stone and John Oldham, I think. Yeah, John Oldham was killed. I don't know if John Stone was, but instead of having like some sort of mediation or some sort of agreement to settle this, they instead went to war with them. And it talks about, where is it? There's like a very important turning point. I want to make sure I get this right. There was a massacre there was the Mystic Massacre. The Mystic Massacre seemed to have broken the Pequot, and it only got worse from there. The Puritans would like hunt down the Pequot to wherever they escaped to, and if say the Pequot escaped to different Indian villages, the Puritans would be like, "Hey, if you have any Pequot, give them up, or we'll fight your entire village." And so naturally, if any Pequot escaped to a different indigenous village or tribe or whatever, they would not be welcomed there, because those indigenous people wouldn't want the smoke with the Puritans. And that's pretty much where the book ends, or not the book, not the whole book, but that's where the chapter ends. It ends with the Puritans, through their conflict with the Pequot, becoming dominant in the region, and there being less of a balance of power. And then one last thing is, this is like showing, if you remember the first chapter, or hopefully I covered it, but the first chapter ended by saying that there was a balance of power between the Spanish and the indigenous people. But we can see that with the English, they're sort of breaking through. They're not establishing any sort of balance of power between them and the other indigenous people. Their colony is growing much stronger, independent of the indigenous people there. And that will show the differences between the how the Spanish settle things and how the English settle things. And then lastly here, just to demonstrate how much power they're accumulating here. While in England, Oliver Cromwell disparaged the Northeast, the American Northeast, as, quote, poor, cold, and useless, end quote. The New English, as they called themselves, were consolidating power over an expanding commonwealth. By 1700, Boston boasted 15 shipyards that produced more ships than all other English colonies combined. In the nautical world, the city was second only to London. Moreover, the Puritans diversified farming, fishing, and trading, dominated England's inter-regional trade across America's coastline, stabilizing British North America throughout the 1600s. There was also, it talked about how, I want to say like in the first year, some colonies suffered like 50% casualties. I'm like estimating, but over time, they would only lose like 5% of their people. I forget which, I didn't have it marked down, but I forget like over what time period it was. But yeah, that's pretty much the end of chapter 2. I felt like there was something else. Oh, in the introduction, it said that indigenous history is sort of buried, and I looked up the note to that, and it wasn't very conclusive. It just cited like a whole book, so I didn't really know what to do with it. But in this chapter, it more specifically cites how indigenous slavery just is barely covered and how there's not a lot of documentation around it. And it cited something much better. I believe it cited a specific page number of a book. So that was refreshing. That was much better, in my opinion. That's pretty much it. I mean, I wish I could have gone more into detail around the Pequot War, because I'm not 100% certain the people they feuded with were called the Pequot, just because that doesn't seem to ring a bell. But the notion still stands that the Puritans went to war against the Pequot. There were tensions over their trade in the wampum, and they defeated them. It doesn't seem like they were totally wiped out. I believe there was like a peace treaty worked out in the end, and that mostly happened because of those two traders who either died or got captured or whatever. The war very much did seem like it was unjust, like it was ridiculous, like it was an excessive response to two traders dying. They would normally have mediation for if one group of people killed the other, but here with the Pequot, it seemed like the Puritans wanted to go to war and they had an excuse, casus belli, as the kids call it. Whew. Well, that's all. That was a lot better, in my opinion, than the first stream. And this one will hopefully be titled correctly. So I'll keep making notes. The reading's a lot easier than the rest of the process. This streaming stuff is not up my alley. But anyway, that's that.